If you've never read something by Tom Wright, I recommend you find one of his books and do so. In his commentary on Mark for Everyone, Tom asked the question regarding this passage: if your house was on fire, what would you rescue? He obviously first talks about people, but then he asks questions about what would be your most important possessions. What would be the things that you grabbed first? And says, maybe those are the things that you value the most. I've been working in a house this week, and a house that had the electricity supply disconnected. So although it was a house, it didn't really feel like a home when it was cold and dark and there was no lights on. We had to work into the evening to make sure that the power was reconnected so that work could commence and the continuing renovation work could take place next week. But it really poses a question, when it comes round to maybe a year's time, when the house is finished and the family are living there and everything's full and all the rooms are filled with their possessions, what would be the things that they treasure the most? What are the things that you treasure in your house the most? What are the most important things? What would be the things that you want to rescue if your house was burning down? Now, maybe it's not a very nice thought to think, well, what would happen if my house was burning? That's a bit extreme. But Tom is trying to make us think about what are the things we treasure most in life. In this passage, a religious leader comes to Jesus and says, well, I know all the commandments that are written in the law, but what are the things that matter the most? He's trying to drill down to Jesus to say, well, should we keep them all? Are they all equal? Or is there things that we should prize and treasure the most above everything? And Jesus answers with the famous words, well, the commandment, love the Lord your God with all your might, all your heart, all your strength. This is the most commandment. This is the most important commandment. And I think we know that. It's a very easy thing to say, isn't it? It's something that maybe we've heard for a long time, certainly something that I would know. Well, what does Jesus say the most important commandment is? I think I've heard this passage so many times, and it's an easy thing to remember, isn't it? So it trips off the tongue. But it's one of those things that's incredibly easy to say and maybe even remember, but is it something that we do? What does it mean to put God first place in our lives? What does it mean to love God above all else? That's really the challenge. And I don't think it's something that we should ever tire of reminding ourselves of. And actually, maybe that's the start of putting God first in everything, is to daily, maybe even hourly, remind ourselves that we are commanded to love him above all else. But then Jesus couples that and says, but also it's important to love your neighbour as yourself. He doesn't just say, well, just love God and then everything will be okay. No, he reminds us that we live in a community and we are to share that love with those around us. So in this self-obsessed age that we live, these things about loving God and loving others can actually be at odds with what the world tells us to do. We live in an age of instant gratification where what we desire is placed most importantly above all else. Amazon, one of the biggest companies on the planet, has this motto that it says, customer first. It's about making you happy, about fulfilling everything that you could possibly want. So to think of something other than ourselves first and foremost in our lives is at odd with the culture in which we live. But it's something that's vital, it's something that's important. As we'll talk about later, it's vital for actually living our life to the fullest. Now, how do we think about God and what we should do every day? Well, really it's about recognizing who God is, isn't it? Putting him in the first place in our lives because we realize his greatness and his magnificence. But we also have to remember that it's not simply an act of us just loving God, it's the fact that God loved us first. And our response is actually to love him in return. You see, God has given us every good thing. And in reality, it's just when we realise that God is Lord of all, he is above all, he is creator of the universe, that we respond to his love and love him back. But that love that he shows us is not just a selfish love, is not just something that he wants us to keep to ourselves. And that's where the second commandment of loving your neighbour as yourself comes into play. Because it's not as though we should have a love, developed from our own internal being and we should shed that abroad. Because, well, our love is flawed, isn't it? Our love is imperfect. But God's love, well, that's the greatest thing of all. So he asks us to be mirrors and reflect his love out into the world which we live. And it's that love that we should share with our neighbour. But actually intertwined with these two commandments is a third, because God doesn't say, well, love your neighbour as you hate yourself, love your neighbour as you despise yourself. No, he says, love your neighbour as you love yourself. Do unto others as you would do unto yourself. That's a common theme, isn't it? And we have to realise that we have to value ourselves first before we can love others around us. But again, where does that value come from? Well, if we realise that God loves us, he values us, he calls us his sons and daughters. If we realise the great value that God sees in us, then hopefully we should realise the value that God places in others as well. We have to realise our place in God's great plan so that we can then value others as co-workers with us. This is all intertwined. We first have to respond to that great love that God showed us so that we can then love him in return, love ourselves and love those around us. Because love is where it all starts. It is because of the love of God that he sends his son to save us. And really that's the crux of everything. Jesus knew what he was talking about. If we can even grasp a glimpse of the love that God has for us, then that will transform this world. That will bring God's kingdom very present. But we need to recognise the place of God in the universe. And I'll go back to the house that I was working on. You see, we had to work late into the night because the power needed to be restored so that work could commence next week. And as the light grew dim and we had to grab the battery lights out, and as I was working outside reconnecting the house electrics back to the main supply, the topic moved on to how important electricity was in our modern society. And the owner of the house commented how it had really transformed society, just the simple thing of electrics. They were also commenting that they wouldn't want to do my job because electricity can sometimes be a bit concerning. It can be rather dangerous, and it's not something that we see, is it? We can't taste it. Well, I hope you don't go licking your plugs to try out, but we certainly don't smell it unless something's gone very wrong. It's something invisible, and yet it's important, because without it, this house was lifeless and cold and without light. It would have been very hard to live there without electricity. Although the house was important itself, in the daylight, in the good times, if you like, the house was perfectly functional. When we were there in the day, there was light streaming in through the windows. It was somewhere where you want to be. You could see the view. You could, enjoy the place in which it's situated. But then as the dark rolled in, I suppose as the bad times came, it was a very hard place to be. And so recognising that electricity could transform that was key. And when finally the supply was reconnected and I tested everything and turned it all on, then suddenly the room sprang into life. Light was restored, and it was actually somewhere where you could have been. If we'd have wanted to, I'm sure we could have reconnected a cooker and made a meal and started to make it a home again. And actually, God's like that. People may think that they don't see him. They may think that they don't need him. But when the dark comes, life without God is very bleak. And actually, God is the essence that brings life to life itself. And we need to realise how important God is, and how when we reconnect with him in our lives, the light floods in. So it's by realising the essence of God in our lives that we realise how important he is. It doesn't matter all the stuff you may have in your house. It doesn't matter all the great things that you may do. You need to realise how important and central God is to everything. So maybe this week you need to take some time to just reflect on the magnificence of God. Realise, what could I do without him? And hopefully you come to the conclusion that, well, I could do very little without God. And then that spurs us on to realise and glorify and magnify God in our lives, and to love him first above all else. Because you see, our lives won't be less full. They won't, it won't be a drag. It won't be something difficult to do. Actually, in loving God first, that enhances everything else that we do. That helps us, give us an identity. It makes us realise how much we need to value ourselves, how much God has loved us. And it also helps us love the community in which we live, which brings the light and life that only God can give to communities into those around us. You see, God's love is so great, it should not ever be contained. And I invite you to invite God into your lives. Let his love slosh around you like a great big light, and then shine that out to those who live around you. So this week, in whatever you do, remind yourself daily, maybe even hourly, to love God first, because he is the source of all, and in responding to him, we live our lives to the fullest.